Welcome to Ancient Britain Myths. Tonight, we delve into the chilling tales of Britain's ghostly royals. The corridors of power are not merely the realms of history, they are also the stages of ghostly hauntings where restless spirits tread the halls of the past. From the shadowed chambers of Windsor Castle to the windswept courtyards of the Tower of London, these spectral monarchs and tragic figures have left an indelible mark, not just on our history, but on our very reality. Why do they linger, these royal phantoms? Are they bound by the weight of their own deeds, or by the relentless tides of betrayal, love, and ambition that once ruled their lives? Join us as we uncover the most infamous royal hauntings in British history, a journey that will leave you questioning the thin veil between life and death. Now settle in by the fire and prepare yourself for our first tale, a story of power, paranoia, and a king whose spirit refuses to rest. This is the ghost of Henry VIII. Windsor Castle stands as one of the oldest and grandest royal residences in the world. But beneath its splendour lies a history steeped in blood, betrayal, and heartbreak. Among its many spectres, none is more notorious than that of Henry VIII, a man whose name alone conjures images of tyranny, excess, and relentless ambition. Born in 1491, Henry VIII ruled England with an iron grip from 1509 until his death in 1547. His reign was marked by a dramatic rupture with the Catholic Church, the establishment of the Church of England, and the ruthless elimination of those who opposed his will. And of course, there were his 6 wives, each a chapter in a saga of love, power, and often tragedy. 2 queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, met their end under the executioner's blade by Henry's decree. Perhaps it is these acts, or others buried in history, that tether his restless spirit to Windsor Castle. Visitors to the castle often recount the unnerving sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the deanery cloister. These are no ordinary steps. They are deliberate, thunderous, and unmistakably regal, as though Henry himself were making his presence known. Many have tried to explain them away as the creaks of an ancient building, but those who have stood in that corridor speak of a chilling sensation, a weight in the air that cannot be ignored. Some have been brave or unlucky enough to glimpse the figure responsible. Witnesses describe a hulking man draped in opulent Tudor robes with a broad, imposing face etched with lines of anger and sorrow. He is said to appear near the chapel, the very place where Henry once knelt in prayer. His expression is distant, as though tormented by memories that cannot be undone. But why does Henry haunt this place? Could it be the sins of his reign? Historians often debate whether Henry VIII felt remorse for his actions, but the ghost stories suggest that, in death, he may bear the burden of his choices. Consider the fates of his wives. Anne Boleyn, who was executed on charges of treason, adultery, and incest. Catherine Howard, her young life cut short in a similar manner. Their deaths were spectacles of the court, orchestrated by the king himself. And yet, some accounts suggest that their ghosts may not be the only ones tied to Henry's legacy. There are tales of strange whispers in the cloister, faint yet unmistakable, words that seem to echo in a forgotten tongue, or perhaps in Tudor English, lost to modern ears. Are these the lamentations of a spirit trapped between this world and the next, or are they echoes of long-dead courtiers reliving their roles in Henry's court? Then there is the story of a castle staff member who encountered an overwhelming sense of dread while cleaning the chapel late one evening. They described a sudden chill so biting it felt as though the warmth had been drawn from the room. Turning, they saw a shadow, a massive figure looming at the edge of the candlelight. Though it vanished as quickly as it appeared, the impression left on their mind was indelible. It wasn't just a shadow, they said. It was him. Henry VIII's ghost is not one of gentle appearances or fleeting visions. It is a presence, a force that reminds all who encounter it of the man's towering influence, even in death. Windsor Castle is, after all, not merely a residence. It's a fortress of history, and Henry VIII remains one of its most commanding spectres. As we leave the shadowed halls of Windsor, one question lingers. Does Henry roam as a punishment for his deeds, or as a king forever unwilling to relinquish his throne? Perhaps we will never know. But if you should ever find yourself wandering those ancient corridors, pause for a moment. Listen for the heavy footsteps. You might find that Henry VIII has not yet abandoned his castle. Now, take a moment to let the fire warm you once again, for our next tale is no less chilling. It is the story of another monarch, a queen whose tragic life and untimely death have left an indelible mark on one of Scotland's most famous royal residences. Let us journey to Holyrood Palace and meet the ghost of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now that the fire has stirred your courage, let us leave Windsor behind and journey north to the rugged, windswept lands of Scotland. Here, amidst the echoes of history and the whispers of tragedy, stands Holyrood Palace, a royal residence with a past as haunting as the spirit said to roam its halls. Tonight we meet one of its most famous phantoms, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart was born into royalty in 1542, inheriting the Scottish throne as an infant. Her life, however, was far from one of ease or peace. A queen by birthright, she became a pawn in political machinations, a prisoner of circumstance, and ultimately a martyr to her own ambition. Married 3 times, embroiled in scandal and accused of plotting against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, Mary was imprisoned for nearly 2 decades before her execution in 1587. It is no wonder that her spirit is said to linger tied to the passions and betrayals that defined her tumultuous life. Holyrood Palace, where Mary resided during her brief but fateful time in Scotland, bears witness to one of her most infamous tragedies. It was here in 1566 that her private secretary, David Rizzio, was brutally murdered. The attack was orchestrated by Mary's second husband, Lord Darnley, who believed Rizzio to be her lover. Dragged from Mary's private chambers, Rizzio was stabbed over 50 times, his blood staining the floors of the palace, a stain, some say, that no amount of cleaning can remove. Many who visit Holyrood Palace claim to feel an oppressive sadness in the very room where Rizzio met his end. But it is not Rizzio's ghost that lingers most prominently. No, it is Mary herself, her spectral presence woven into the fabric of the palace. Those who have encountered her describe a figure in regal 16th century attire, her gown shimmering faintly as though caught between this world and the next. One account comes from a historian visiting the palace late one evening. As they walked the halls, they reported a sudden chill that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Turning a corner, they found themselves face to face with a woman whose pale features were unmistakably regal. Her eyes, though sorrowful, held a piercing intensity, and then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender, a fragrance Mary was known to favour in life. Others have reported hearing Mary's voice, soft, melodic, but tinged with despair. These disembodied whispers often seem to echo from the very staircase where she would have descended to meet her court. "Why?" she is said to murmur, as if eternally questioning the betrayals that sealed her fate. But Mary's spirit is not confined to Holyrood. Tales of her ghost have been reported across Scotland and even in England, particularly at Fotheringhay Castle, where she was executed. Yet, it is at Holyrood where her presence feels most vivid, perhaps because this was a place where she experienced not only grief but fleeting moments of joy. Here she danced, she ruled, and she dreamed of a united kingdom under her reign, a dream that would ultimately cost her everything. One particularly chilling story involves a palace guard who in the early hours of a winter morning saw a flickering light emanating from Mary's old chambers. Believing someone had mistakenly left a candle burning, he entered the room, only to find it empty. But as he turned to leave, he felt a cold hand rest briefly on his shoulder. Startled, he spun around, only to see the faint outline of Mary standing by the window, gazing out over the misty gardens. The guard fled, but the experience stayed with him forever. As we leave Holyrood Palace, the question remains, is Mary, Queen of Scots, a restless spirit bound by the betrayals of her life? Or is she a queen who refuses to relinquish her place in history? Whatever the answer, Her ghost reminds us of the tragic cost of ambition, power, and betrayal. Now let us return to the fire for a moment of warmth. But do not get too comfortable. Our next tale takes us to Hampton Court Palace, where the spirit of King Charles I walks the shadows of history. Now as the fire flickers and the shadows deepen, let us journey to Hampton Court Palace. A place steeped in history, this grand residence witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs, the splendour of royal courts, and the sorrow of betrayals. Among the many spirits said to linger here, one stands apart, a king whose tragic end reverberates through the centuries. This is the story of King Charles I. Charles I was not born to the tumult of rebellion, but to the stability of royal privilege. Ascending to the throne in 1625, he was a ruler of contradictions, deeply devout, yet uncompromising in his belief in the divine right of kings. His reign, however, was marked by conflict as his decisions sparked civil war between the Crown and Parliament. By 1649, Charles I was a defeated man, imprisoned and condemned to death by his own people. His execution on a bitter January morning shocked the world, marking the first and only time an English king was publicly beheaded. But while Charles may have met his mortal end in London, his spirit is said to have returned to Hampton Court, a palace he cherished in life. Here visitors and staff have reported eerie occurrences that defy explanation. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors, doors creaking open without a touch, and, most unsettling of all, fleeting glimpses of a regal figure in 17th century attire. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a palace curator who was working late one winter evening. As they passed by the chapel, they noticed a faint light glowing from within. Thinking it strange, they entered to investigate, only to be struck by an overwhelming stillness. The air seemed to hum with an unseen presence, and then they saw him, a man kneeling at the altar, his head bowed in prayer. Though his form was faint, the distinctive features of King Charles I were unmistakable. The curator stood frozen, watching as the figure slowly rose, turned, and walked towards the door, only to vanish before reaching it. Other witnesses have spoken of feeling an inexplicable heaviness in the palace's great hall. One tourist described the sensation as like being pressed down by centuries of sorrow. Some believe this is the residual energy of Charles's despair lingering in the very stones of the palace. After all, it was within these walls that Charles would have contemplated the unravelling of his kingdom, his crown slipping from his grasp, and his inevitable fate. But why does Charles haunt Hampton Court? Is it a longing for the splendour he once knew, or penance for the blood spilled during the English Civil War? Perhaps it is neither. Some speculate that Charles's spirit remains because he has unfinished business, a monarch who seeks vindication, even in death. One particularly chilling tale involves a group of visitors who participated in a nighttime ghost tour. As they stood in the chapel, a woman in the group began to feel faint. She later recounted hearing whispers too faint to discern, but undeniably present. Turning toward the altar, she thought she saw a shadow move, slow and deliberate. The tour guide assured her that no one had passed by, but the experience left her shaken. It was as if someone was there watching us, someone who didn't belong to our time. King Charles I's story is one of loss of his throne, his family, and his life. Yet his spirit endures as though he refuses to let history close the chapter on his reign. And so, Hampton Court remains a place where the past and present collide, where the echoes of a fallen king remind us of the fragility of power. But our journey is far from over. Let us now leave the shadows of Hampton Court and travel south to a place of quiet elegance. Osborne House, nestled on the Isle of Wight, was once the cherished retreat of Queen Victoria. Yet, even in death, Victoria's presence is said to remain, watching over her beloved home and the memories it holds. Now, as the firelight dances and the hour grows late, let us leave behind the grand halls of Hampton Court and journey south to the tranquil shores of the Isle of Wight. Here stands Osborne House, a residence not of political power, but of personal retreat. This was the cherished home of Queen Victoria, the longest reigning monarch of her time, and her beloved husband, Prince Albert. Their legacy is woven into the very walls of this stately home. But even after her death, it seems that Queen Victoria has not entirely departed. Queen Victoria adored Osborne House. Built in the Italianate style, its serene surroundings offered a haven away from the pressures of royal life. It was here that she and Prince Albert raised their children, finding a rare sense of normalcy amidst the demands of empire. Yet, after Albert's death in 1861, Osborne became a place of mourning for Victoria. She withdrew from public life, retreating to its halls to grieve in solitude. Even in her final years, she insisted on spending as much time there as possible. And when she passed away in 1901, it was within the comforting embrace of Osborne. Perhaps it is this deep attachment that explains why many believe Victoria's spirit remains. Staff and visitors have often spoken of an unshakable presence in certain parts of the house. Some describe it as a faint chill in the air, while others report a distinct feeling of being watched, as though the Queen herself is still keeping a watchful eye on her beloved retreat. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a former groundskeeper who was inspecting the property late one evening. As he walked past one of the house's grand windows, he saw the faint outline of a woman standing inside. Dressed in black mourning attire, she seemed to be gazing out across the gardens, her posture regal yet sorrowful. The groundskeeper, initially assuming it was a visitor who had lingered after hours, approached the house. But as he drew closer, the figure vanished before his eyes, leaving him both startled and awestruck. Within the house itself, the bedroom where Victoria passed away is said to hold the strongest presence. Visitors often report a sudden sense of heaviness upon entering, as though the weight of her grief still lingers in the air. Some claim to hear faint footsteps pacing the room, while others have described the faint scent of violets, Victoria's favourite flower, despite no blooms being present. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from a young historian who stayed overnight to study the house's history. Awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of soft rustling, they opened their eyes to find a faint light emanating from the doorway. The light grew stronger, revealing the figure of a woman in Victorian dress, her face partially obscured by the shadows. Though she did not speak, her presence was unmistakable, and her sorrow seemed almost tangible. The historian described the encounter as deeply unsettling, yet strangely moving. It was as if she was still here, holding on to the home she loved so dearly. But Queen Victoria's ghost is not one of malice or unrest. Those who sense her presence often describe it as watchful, protective even. She spent her happiest and most heartbreaking moments at Osborne House, and it seems she has chosen to remain, preserving the memory of a life filled with love, loss, and devotion. And so we leave Osborne House carrying with us the lingering impression of a queen whose spirit endures, a timeless guardian of her cherished retreat. But our journey is not yet over. As we return to the fire, prepare yourself for one final tale, a story of betrayal, love, and the most famous ghost in British history. Let us meet Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated queen whose spectral presence haunts the Tower of London. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, let us turn to the final tale of our journey, a story of love, betrayal, and the enduring shadow of one of England's most enigmatic queens. This is the haunting of Anne Boleyn at the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn's story is one of the most tragic and captivating in British history. Born into the ambitious Boleyn family, Anne rose to prominence as the second wife of King Henry VIII, capturing his heart and changing the course of England's history. Her intelligence, charm, and wit made her a force to be reckoned with in the Tudor court. But her ascent came at a steep price, and her reign as queen would end in betrayal, imprisonment, and death. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations widely believed to have been fabricated by her enemies and, perhaps, by Henry himself. She was brought to the Tower of London, where she awaited her fate. Accounts describe her as composed and dignified, even in the face of death. On May 19th, she was executed by a French swordsman, her final words a prayer for mercy and forgiveness. But Anne's story did not end that day. For centuries, her restless spirit has been seen and felt within the tower's ancient walls. The most famous sightings of Anne Boleyn occur near the Queen's house, where she was imprisoned, and on Tower Green, the site of her execution. Witnesses describe her as headless, her ghostly form carrying her severed head in her hands. Yet even in death, she is said to exude an air of grace and sorrow, as though mourning not only her life, but the legacy she left behind. One chilling account comes from a guard stationed at the tower in the early 19th century. While patrolling the grounds late at night, he saw a white, glowing figure gliding silently across the green. As he approached, the figure turned, revealing a regal woman in Tudor dress, her head tucked beneath her arm. The guard, overcome with fear, fainted on the spot. When he regained consciousness, there was no trace of the figure, but the memory of her haunting presence stayed with him forever. Other tales speak of Anne's ghost appearing in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried. Visitors have reported seeing a faint figure kneeling in prayer, her translucent form illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Some have heard the faint sound of weeping, a sorrowful echo of Anne's final moments. But perhaps the most extraordinary account comes from a yeoman warder, who in the mid-20th century claimed to have seen Anne walking the halls of the tower late one night. Dressed in her signature Tudor gown, her spectral form moved with purpose, her eyes fixed straight ahead. It was as if she was reliving her last walk, he said, a queen, even in death, holding her dignity as she faced her end. What binds Anne to the tower? Is it the betrayal of a king who once professed to love her? The cruelty of a court that turned against her? Or does she linger to remind us of the cost of ambition and the fragility of power? Whatever the reason, her presence serves as a haunting testament to the human spirit's resilience, even in the face of the ultimate tragedy. As we leave the Tower of London, one question remains. Does Anne Boleyn haunt these grounds out of sorrow or defiance? Perhaps it is both, a queen who, even in death, refuses to be forgotten. And now, as the fire burns low and the night grows still, we return to where we began. The stories of Britain's ghostly royals remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and events. It is alive, etched into the walls of castles and palaces, whispered in the corridors of time, and perhaps carried in the footsteps of those who refuse to let go. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Britain's haunted past. If you've enjoyed this tale of royalty and the supernatural, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow seekers of the mysterious. Until next time, may your nights be quiet and your dreams undisturbed.